Rousseau was born in 1712 in Geneva and died in 1778 in France, spending most of his adult life in France. This means he was living in pre-revolutionary France, dying just 10 years before the revolution. First-hand witnessing the injustices of the monarchy and the privilege clearly inspired his beliefs. His works, such as discourses on the sciences and arts and the social contract, inspired revolutionaries like Robespierre and the Jacobins. So now let's dive into what he was actually saying. But a quick disclaimer beforehand, Rousseau's philosophy largely builds off of Hobbes's and Locke's philosophy, so it's really helpful to know about Hobbes and Locke before jumping into Rousseau. If you need help catching up with Hobbes and Locke, do check out my 2 previous videos I did in this mini-series going over their respective philosophies. But now let's continue the chats about the state of nature. To quickly get you up to speed, the state of nature is what society would look like without any government, laws, or institutions. So what society might look like in its completely natural state. Hobbes believed that in a state of nature we'd end up in war, whereas Locke believed that in a state of nature we'd try and help each other out and care for each other. But ultimately both philosophers agreed that a state of nature would fail. That is to say, both philosophers believed that humans could not coexist in a state of nature without eventually turning against each other. They thought this would happen because they both believed that our biggest motivation as human beings is self-preservation. And so whether it be out of fear, suspicion, or limited resources, we would ultimately turn against each other in order to survive. In short, both Hobbes and Locke believed that society was too fragile to survive without some form of civil government to maintain peace. But then Rousseau came along and he found some faults with Hobbes and Locke's state of nature. Rousseau believed that when Hobbes and Locke were doing their thought experiments on the state of nature, they overlooked one key part of human behavior, which is compassion and pity.
Have you no pity, no compassion?
Rousseau thought that if we considered the role of compassion and pity in a state of nature, we might find that living in a state of nature would be feasible after all. Further, Rousseau believed that there was a key difference between society men and natural men, which he felt like Hobbes and Locke did not consider. To Rousseau, society men are those who have been exposed to the ways of society and the civilized condition, whereas natural men are the opposite. They're people who have never been exposed to society's ways. But what difference might this make? Rousseau thought it was the difference between amour-propre and amour de soi.
Pardon my French there.
Rousseau believed that society man had amour-propre, which is a socially dependent form of self-love based on others' opinions and approval, whereas natural men had amour de soi, which is a healthier form of self-love based on self-preservation. He believed that this different way of loving oneself would manifest into how they act in a state of nature, and we'll get more into that later in the video. But first, he believed that Hobbes and Locke had considered their state of nature using society men instead of natural men, and Rousseau did not like that Locke and Hobbes had done this. For him, there's a huge difference between the society men and the natural men, and he's very cynical about civilized society. He actually believed that the arts and sciences corrupted morality and that we were better off as natural men.
There is no place for me in a civilized society.
But maybe Rousseau should read Cormac McCarthy before making that claim and get back to me on that one. But back to Rousseau's state of nature. Given his acknowledgement of compassion and pity and his proposed difference between society men and natural men, would a state of nature now work? So let's get into Rousseau's revised state of nature given these considerations. Rousseau held that we are naturally sympathetic to others and would take steps to avoid harming others, and that's our compassion and pity kicking in. And so in a state of nature, we wouldn't go out of our way to hurt each other, but we would try and keep to ourselves and not cause harm to others.
I was just minding my own business.
But would our natural sympathies, compassion and pity be enough to stop war in a state of nature? Let's say in a moment of scarcity where there's not enough food for everyone and only a few will survive. Will compassion and pity be strong enough to prevent us from turning on each other and competing for that limited resource of food? Probably not. And even Rousseau admitted this. Compassion and pity might stop petty thefts or taking advantage of the sick and weak, but it wouldn't stop that need for survival if the situation was dire enough. Ultimately, Rousseau acknowledged that self-preservation would triumph over compassion and pity. So how did he deal with this issue? Well, he reframes what mankind would be like in a state of nature. As I said earlier, he distinguishes between the society man and the natural man. So what did Rousseau think natural men would look and act like in a state of nature? Well, first he believed that natural men would scarcely come in contact with each other. Away from society, men would be quite solitary beings.
In my solitude.
We don't have strong enough compassion to want families naturally, he believes. Natural men would realistically just want to mate every so often and then move on. And he also believed that we wouldn't want to congregate in groups because our self-preservation would advise us against it because of the spread of diseases. The only other things we'd be focused on is feeding ourselves and sleeping.
Now you're talking!
And so in all the time it takes for hunting and gathering, we wouldn't really be bothered to deal with other people.
You know, that's the trouble with living halfway up a cliff. You feel so cut off. You know, it takes me 2 hours every morning to get out onto the moors, collect my berries, chastise myself, and 2 hours back in the evening.
And just like that, Rousseau believed we'd be self-preserving. We don't need anything else and we don't need anyone else. And importantly, our natural solitude would rule out any desire for power, reputation, glory, wealth, because we wouldn't care about the opinions of others. And it's these desires, the desire for glory, wealth, and power, that make Hobbes and Locke believe that a state of nature would ultimately fail. So to wrap up Rousseau's state of nature, first he believed that we'd live in solitude and effectively mind our own business. And because of our natural aversion to harming others, we wouldn't want to get in each other's way or steal from other people. But why is Rousseau's refined version of a state of nature important?
Oh, right. Why should we care?
Well, he uses this peaceful and optimistic view of a state of nature to argue where society went wrong. Which is a crazy claim, but he believed that at this point in time, in that type of state of nature, society was at its sweetest point. We weren't totally helpless. We had innovations like fire and tools to be able to survive, but we didn't have things like communal groups, which he believed would start cycles of comparisons, revenge, envy, shame.
Oh well, Mr. Robinson's cave's never been exactly nirvana, has it?
Well, quite, that's what I mean. Anyway, Mr. Rogers, he's the hermit.
On the end?
Up at the
Oh,
top, yes.
yeah.
Well, he tried wattles and he came out in a rash.
Really?
Or luxury goods, which would feed feelings of envy, competition, pride, and make us feel dependent on things that we don't really need to survive.
But I can't live without my laptop!
But even though Rousseau thinks that this point of time was society's best point, we can't and we shouldn't go back to this form of society. What does Rousseau think we should do instead? He believed that we need to reinvent society from the ground up, but this time focus on things like equality, freedom, and a collective will. What does Rousseau's ideal society look like? Rousseau believed that the only legitimate government would be a government that's based on a social contract. First, everyone must agree to live under the set laws, and second, they must set those laws for themselves. What? For Rousseau, citizens must come together and directly decide the rules and laws for a society. That is a direct democracy. That means no king, no elite ruling class, and no laws handed down from above. And this differs largely from Hobbes and Locke. Hobbes wanted an absolute sovereign, which is the complete opposite of Rousseau, and Locke wanted a representative democracy. There is actually a good modern day example of the type of society that Rousseau wanted, and that's Christiania in Denmark. The people living inside the community decide their own laws. But getting into the details of Rousseau's ideal society, one thing we must address is the general will, and this is one of Rousseau's major ideas that he came up with. The general will is the idea that when deciding laws, it's not just about listening to the majority opinion, but considering what's best for everyone as a whole in your society, even if it means that it's not what individually benefits you.
Maybe the decision about what's best for everyone.
So in Rousseau's ideal society, you wouldn't just vote for what might individually benefit you, but you'd vote for what benefits the collective. And like this, in a modern society with a direct democracy and the general will, Rousseau believed that we'd be the most free. We're not just living by our selfish impulses, but we're practicing compassion and pity and expressing our moral selves through the laws that obey the general will. So there's my brief summary of Rousseau, and that calls for the end of this mini-series about Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. If you've watched all 3 videos or even just one, thank you so much for your time and for giving these videos a chance. Thank you very much.